I paid the mortgage on my daughter's peace of mind for 6 years before I found out what it actually cost her. I told myself I was being a good father. I was. That was never the problem. The problem was I never asked what she was protecting me from, and by the time I did, the answer had already cost an old man his dignity. Some daughters shield their fathers because they think he's too fragile for the truth. I'm your neighbor down the road, the guy who waves at you from his porch every morning, and I need you to sit with me for 14 minutes because I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why I stopped waving at one particular house on my street. My name is Walter Pemberton. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years running a small HVAC repair company in Danbury, Connecticut, before I handed it to my nephew and told myself I'd earned the right to slow down. My wife, Carol, passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral. And I won't dwell on that because that's not tonight's story. But I mention it because it matters later. I have one daughter, Renee, 34, a dental hygienist, and for a long time she was the only reason I got out of bed some mornings after Carol died. I'm telling you this so you understand something important. I was not a man looking for trouble. I was a man trying to be quiet and useful in whatever years I had left. I thought I understood what that looked like. I was wrong about the shape it would eventually take. Renee married a man named Curtis Vance 2 years after her mother died. I liked him, or at least I liked the version of him I was shown. And that distinction is the whole reason I'm sitting here talking to you tonight, instead of just being a happy retired man watching the Red Sox with his daughter on Sundays. Curtis worked in commercial insurance, drove a clean gray Tahoe, remembered my birthday without being reminded, and complimented my tomato plants every single time he came by, which I'll admit meant more to me than it should have. Grief makes you generous with your trust. I want you to remember that, because it's going to explain a lot of what I let slide over the following 2 years. Here's where I need you to watch the pattern with me, because I didn't watch it myself until it was almost too late. About 14 months into the marriage, Renee stopped coming by on Wednesdays. We used to do dinner every Wednesday, just the two of us, a standing thing since she was 19 years old, rain or shine, a habit that survived her mother's death, and even survived the first 6 months of her own marriage. Then one Wednesday she texted saying Curtis had a work thing and she'd rather stay home in case he needed her. I said, sure, no problem, sweetheart. Go be a good wife. The next Wednesday, same thing. By the third Wednesday, I noticed but I didn't say anything, because I told myself a newly married woman is allowed to reprioritize her calendar, and a father who makes a fuss about that is the kind of father nobody wants around. What I didn't notice, because I wasn't looking for it, was that Renee had also stopped mentioning her savings account. She used to talk about money the way some people talk about the weather, casual, constant, no weight to it. She'd tell me she moved $200 into her Roth, or that she was finally hitting her emergency fund target. Small, proud updates a daughter gives her father because she knows he worries. Somewhere around month 16, those updates just stopped. I assumed it was because married finances get complicated and private, and a good father doesn't pry into his daughter's marriage. That assumption cost me a year of clarity I'll never get back. In April of last year, Renee asked if she could borrow $4,000 for what she called a car repair emergency, and I gave it to her without a second thought, because that's what fathers do, and because $4,000 meant nothing to me next to my daughter's stress lines. In June, it was another $2,800, this time for insurance stuff. Don't worry about it, Dad. I didn't worry about it. That was exactly the mistake. I wrote the check, hugged her, told her family helps family, and went back to my tomatoes. I was proud of myself for not asking questions. I thought that was respect. I know now it was negligence wearing a nicer word. The thing about Curtis that made all of this so hard to see coming is that he was, by every visible measure, a genuinely decent presence in the room. He fixed my gutter one Saturday without being asked, just showed up with a ladder because he'd noticed it sagging the week before. When my neighbor Doris broke her hip in the fall, Curtis was the one who drove her to physical therapy twice a week for a month because her own son lived out of state and couldn't get there fast enough. I watched this man be kind to strangers with a consistency that made the tightness I sometimes felt in my chest around him seem like my own paranoia, some widower's suspicion I needed to get over. I told myself the problem was me, that I was a man who'd lost his wife and was now afraid of losing his daughter too, seeing shadows where there weren't any. I was almost right. I was just looking at the wrong shadow. Renee and Curtis threw an anniversary party in September, their second, at a rented hall out on Route 7, and that's the night I first heard the name that would end up unraveling everything. I was getting a drink at the bar when a woman I didn't recognize, mid-50s, kind face, work boots under a nice dress like she'd come straight from a shift, was talking to another guest a few feet away, and I heard her say, clear as anything, "Somebody needs to check on Arthur. He hasn't answered his phone in 4 days, and Denise won't return my calls either." I didn't think much of it at the time. Arthur and Denise weren't names I knew. I filed it away the way you file away half of any party conversation, meaning I forgot it completely by the time I got home. I didn't think about that sentence again until the following February, 5 months later, on a Tuesday morning that started like every other Tuesday morning of my retirement, meaning it started with coffee on my porch and absolutely no warning that my life was about to reorganize itself around one overheard sentence at a hardware store checkout line. I was at Hendrick's Hardware on Route 7, the same road as that anniversary hall, picking up fittings for a leaking outdoor spigot, and the woman ahead of me in line was talking to the cashier while she waited for her card to process. She was telling him about her week, the way people do with cashiers they've known for years. And she said something about how exhausting it had been driving out to check on the Kettering place again because nobody in that family answers a phone anymore since Denise passed. Kettering. Denise. I felt something cold move through my stomach before my brain even caught up to why. I turned to her and said, probably too abruptly, "I'm sorry, did you say Kettering?" She looked at me the way you look at someone who's interrupted a private thought. She said, "You know them?" I said, "My son-in-law's name is Curtis Vance. Does that mean anything to you?" And her face did something I will never forget, as long as I live. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. And underneath the recognition, something that looked almost like relief, like she'd been waiting 2 years for someone to finally ask her the right question. Her name was Sandra Ruiz, and she told me right there in the checkout line, while the cashier pretended to be very busy with the register, that she'd been the home health aide for Arthur Kettering, 78 years old, and his late wife Denise, who had died the previous winter, until nobody was left to pay her and she'd had to stop coming, even though she still drove out twice a month on her own time, because somebody had to look in on him. I said, "I don't understand. Who is Arthur Kettering to my son-in-law?" Sandra looked at me for a long moment and said, "Arthur Kettering is Curtis's father. Denise was his stepmother." "You didn't know that?" I told her no, I did not know that. Curtis had told Renee, and Renee had told me, that his parents were both gone. His father dead of a heart attack when Curtis was in his 20s, no other family to speak of, which was part of what had made him seem, in the early days, like a man who understood loss the way I did. Sandra gave me the address before I even asked for it, like she'd been holding on to it for exactly this reason. Birch Hollow Road, out past the county line, maybe 25 minutes from my own house, 25 minutes from a life I thought I understood completely. She told me Arthur had been managing on a fixed income and a modest pension from 30 years at an aluminum plant, that after Denise died, Curtis had shown up, arranged for Arthur to sign some paperwork for tax purposes, and that within 4 months, the home health aide, meaning Sandra, had gone unpaid, the housekeeper had been let go, and Arthur had started rationing his own blood pressure medication because he said money was tight right now, just for a little while. Sandra said the last time she'd driven out, back in December, Arthur had answered the door in a coat because he said he was keeping the heat lower to save money. She said she'd cried in her car afterward and hadn't been able to make herself go back until last week, and even then he hadn't answered. I want to be honest with you about what I felt standing in that hardware store, because I think it's important, and because some of you have felt exactly this before, and I want you to know you're not the only one. It wasn't rage yet. Rage came later, and it came quiet, not loud. What I felt first was a kind of falling sensation, like the floor under 16 months of my daughter's life had just been shown to me as a stage set, painted plywood standing in for something solid. I thanked Sandra, wrote her number down on the back of my hardware receipt, and drove straight to Birch Hollow Road instead of home, because I am not, whatever else you learn about me tonight, a man who can sit on a thing like that for even one more day. The house was small, vinyl-sided, the kind of place that had been well kept once, and was now just barely holding on, gutters sagging in a way that made me think of my own before Curtis fixed mine, which felt like an unbearable little joke at that moment. I knocked. It took almost 2 full minutes before I heard shuffling, and then the door opened on a chain, and an old man's face looked out at me through the gap, wary, in a way that broke something in my chest before he'd even said a word. I told him my name, told him I was Curtis's father-in-law, and Arthur Kettering's whole face changed, the wariness draining out of it, and something almost like hunger replacing it. Hunger for conversation, for a visitor, for anyone. He took the chain off. He apologized for the state of the house before I'd even stepped inside, which is something I've thought about every day since. An old man in his own home, apologizing to a stranger for being poor. Inside, it was clean but nearly bare, no television, I noticed. And when I asked, he said quietly that he'd sold it in October, along with Denise's jewelry, along with a coin collection that had been his own father's, all of it, he said, just to keep the lights on until things sort themselves out. He was wearing 2 sweaters. The thermostat on the wall, when I glanced at it, read 58 degrees. I asked him, as gently as I knew how, what exactly had happened with the money, and Arthur told me that after Denise's funeral, Curtis had come to him crying, saying he was drowning, that a business investment had gone bad, that he was ashamed to ask, but could Arthur possibly help bridge things for a few months, and that Arthur, grieving and lonely and desperate to feel useful to his only child, had signed over access to his pension direct deposit, just to make it easier, just temporarily. He hadn't seen a statement since August. He said Curtis visited maybe once every 6 or 7 weeks, always in a hurry, always with some reason he couldn't stay long. He said the last time Curtis had been out, back before Thanksgiving, he'd taken the good armchair from the living room, said he needed to borrow it for staging, a rental property he was flipping, and never brought it back. Arthur was sitting, when I found him, in a folding chair from the garage. I sat with Arthur Kettering for 2 hours that afternoon. I made him a sandwich from what little was in his refrigerator, because I noticed he hadn't offered me anything, which I understood immediately was not rudeness, but embarrassment, a man who no longer had enough to offer a guest and couldn't bear to say so. Somewhere in that conversation, Arthur said something that I don't think I will ever stop hearing. He said, "I used to think if I just didn't complain, he'd remember on his own that I was still here." That sentence sat on my chest the entire drive home, and honestly, it's still sitting there right now, telling you this. I didn't confront Curtis that day. I didn't even tell Renee. I want to explain why, because I think it's the most important decision I made in this entire story, and I think it's the thing that separates doing right by someone from just being angry at them. I drove home, sat in my truck in my own driveway for a long time without going inside, and I made myself a promise that whatever I did next, I was going to do it for Arthur Kettering first, and only secondarily for my own feelings about my son-in-law. Anger wants an audience. What I needed instead was a plan. The next morning I called an elder law attorney in Danbury, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Ramaswamy, who had helped a friend of mine untangle a guardianship mess a few years back. I told her everything. She asked me a series of careful, specific questions whether Arthur still had his full mental faculties, which he clearly did, sharp as a tack once you got him talking, just isolated and worn down, whether there was a formal power of attorney or just informal access to his accounts, whether Arthur himself wanted help or whether he was, in some complicated way, still protecting his son the way Sandra Ruiz had been protecting him. Priya told me something I've repeated to myself many times since. She said, "An old man doesn't lose his rights just because his son took advantage of his love." She said if Arthur was willing, They could freeze the direct deposit redirection, get his pension routed back into an account only he controlled, and, if he chose, pursue restitution for what had already been taken. She also told me, gently, that none of this would happen unless Arthur asked for it himself, because coercing him into a decision, even a good one, wasn't something she'd participate in, and honestly, hearing her say that made me trust her more, not less. I drove back out to Birch Hollow Road 2 days later, and I asked Arthur straight out if he wanted help getting his money and his independence back. And I watched an old man's eyes fill up in a way that told me everything about how long he'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to ask him that question instead of just deciding things for him. He said yes. He said it twice, like he needed to hear himself say it before he believed it. Priya moved fast. Within a week, Arthur had a new checking account that only he could access. His pension direct deposit had been legally redirected, and Priya had sent a formal letter to Curtis, notifying him that the informal financial arrangement was terminated effective immediately, and that Arthur reserved the right to pursue recovery of misappropriated funds. I paid Priya's retainer myself, quietly, and told Arthur it was a loan he could pay back whenever, knowing full well I never intended to collect on it, and knowing he probably understood that too. I still hadn't told Renee anything. Here's where the days started to matter, because Curtis, once that letter landed, did exactly what a cornered man does. He started making noise in every direction except the right one. He called my house twice that Thursday, voicemails I didn't return, something vague about wanting to talk, Walter, before this gets blown out of proportion. Friday, it was 3 calls. By the following Tuesday, he'd stopped calling me and started showing up unannounced at Renee's own house with his temper. If what Renee told me afterward was accurate, worse than she'd ever seen it, snapping at her about your father meddling in things that aren't his business, which of course was the first time Renee had heard any of this from anyone but her own increasingly rattled husband. Renee called me that Tuesday night in tears, not understanding what was happening, only that Curtis had come home furious about a lawyer and his father and money, and could I please explain what on earth was going on. I told her everything, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt. The whole story. Sandra Ruiz in the hardware line, Birch Hollow Road, the folding chair, the 58-degree thermostat, the coin collection sold for grocery money. I heard my daughter go completely silent on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that's full of a person's entire understanding of her marriage rearranging itself in real time. Renee drove to my house that same night, and we sat up until nearly 2 in the morning. She told me things I hadn't known, that Curtis had always said his father was dead, that she'd never once been invited to meet him, that on the 2 occasions she'd asked to visit his side of the family, Curtis had gotten strangely cold and changed the subject, and she'd let it go because grief, real or invented, felt like sacred ground you don't push on. She told me about the $4,000, the $2,800, and at least 3 other transfers I hadn't known about, all explained away with urgency and vague language, all of it. She now understood with growing horror, likely funneled toward covering the hole Curtis had dug with his own father's pension, while he waited for some other plan to bail him out that never came. I want to tell you Renee left him that night in some dramatic scene, but that's not what happened, and I think that's actually a truer thing to tell you. She didn't leave for another 11 days. She needed to see it for herself first, she said, the same way I had needed to drive to Birch Hollow Road myself, instead of just trusting Sandra Ruiz's word. On a Saturday morning, she asked me to come with her, and we drove out together, and Renee met her father-in-law for the very first time, in a house with a thermostat at 58 degrees, and no television, and a folding chair where an armchair should have been. Arthur Kettering looked at Renee and said, "You're the wife." Not a question. Renee said yes. And then this old man, who had every reason in the world to be bitter, who had sold his dead wife's jewelry to keep his lights on while his son bought himself a nicer truck that spring, reached out and took my daughter's hand and said, "None of this is on you." I watched my daughter cry harder at that sentence than I'd seen her cry since her mother's funeral. Renee filed for divorce the following month. She didn't go after Curtis for the money he'd taken from her directly. Priya had advised her that pursuing it might tangle up and slow down Arthur's own restitution case. And Renee, without a second's hesitation, said Arthur's case mattered more, which is, I think, the single proudest moment I've had as her father in 34 years of being one. Curtis, for his part, never did pay back what Priya's investigation eventually documented, as just over $31,000 redirected from his father's accounts over roughly 10 months. He moved 2 states away by summer, and last I heard through the grapevine of a small town that doesn't forget things easily, he'd already found new work, new acquaintances, presumably a new version of the story, where he's the one who's been wronged. I think about that a lot. Actually, the idea that men like Curtis don't stop, they just relocate. Somewhere out there right now, there's probably another aging parent, another trusting stranger, hearing about a business investment that went bad, being asked to bridge things just for a few months. I don't have an answer for that. I only have Arthur. Because here's how this story actually ends, and I think it's the part that matters most. Arthur Kettering is 79 now. His pension is entirely his own again. His heat is set at 68 degrees. And he bought himself a small television at Christmas that he is unreasonably, wonderfully proud of. Renee and I drive out to see him most Sundays. She brings him the crossword from the paper because he complained once that he missed doing them with Denise, and now the two of them sit at his kitchen table most Sunday afternoons arguing pleasantly over 7-letter words while I fix whatever's broken around the house. Because apparently I never really stopped being a man who fixes things, even when the thing that needed fixing wasn't a furnace or a spigot, but a person who'd simply been forgotten. Arthur told me something a few weeks ago that I haven't been able to shake, and I want to leave you with it, because I think it's the whole reason I sat down to tell you this story tonight. He said, I spent a year thinking I'd done something to deserve being invisible. I told him, no, sir, you didn't do a single thing. Some people just count on us being too polite, too proud, or too in love with them to ever say we noticed. Renee tells him the same thing every single Sunday, in her own way, by simply showing up, which I've come to believe might be the only apology that ever actually counts for anything. I don't know if Curtis Vance ever thinks about his father. I don't know if somewhere out there he tells a new version of this story where he's the victim of an overbearing father-in-law who couldn't mind his own business. I've stopped needing to know. What I know instead is that an old man who used to apologize for being poor in his own home now leaves his porch light on for us every Sunday because he likes watching for our headlights coming up Birch Hollow Road. And there is nothing in this world that has made me feel more useful in my 63 years than being one of 2 people that light is waiting for. If you've ever had to choose between staying quiet to keep the peace and speaking up because someone weaker than you needed you to, I want to hear about it. Because I have a feeling more of you have stood exactly where I stood in that hardware store checkout line than will ever say so out loud in the daylight. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me who you would have chosen. This has been Walter, and I will see you next time.